Okay, I'll start. All Smithy's fault for getting me into race management. She got pregnant and messed up our 1974 sailing season. There was nothing to it but to volunteer as race officer to Lough Regatta. We used our large Loch Mask fishing boat that year as a somewhat primitive committee boat. And then the same thing happened in 1979, but fortunately after that we realized what was causing it. Lough in 74 had newly begun committee boat starts for the regattas. Prior to that, Colonel Hooker had presided over the starts from his hut on the castle pier. Two starting lines were available. Number one, off towards St. David's House, which was suitable for southwesterly winds, and a number two line stretching out beyond Goose Island's west end, suitable for northwesterly winds or exciting reaching starts. Of course, these fixed lines were restricting, and moves were made by the then Sailing Secretary Peter Huskinson to get the Colonel Hooker afloat, but to no avail. Also, both lines were affected by weed, which caught around the plates prior to the starts. I was lucky to work with Jock Smith on a committee boat a number of times in the mid-70s. He was Ireland's preeminent race officer at the time and had officiated at the America's Cup qualifiers in the States. He was a brilliant mentor, cool, calm, and collected, as befitted a senior pilot in Aer Lingus. He instilled in me the concept that it was not us, the race committee, versus them, the competitors. And after that, I always tried to practice open communication with the fleet. Jock also taught us that it was supposed to be fun, albeit efficiently carried out. The Phoenix was well used to regattas and race officer work. She carried my great uncle as officer of the day in the first decade of the 20th century on numerous occasions, including in Mount Shannon in 1903. 100 years later, David resurrected this regatta, presenting the very same Mount Shannon Cup. Jock returned to haunt me when he was officiating at Lough Regatta in 1985. Early in the week, he slipped while getting onto the barge Eureka, where he was staying with Artie and Una Corbett, and fractured his pelvis. I was woken up next morning with the news that I would be taking over as PRO for the week and thrown in at the deep end, starting with the Belle Isle Plate in a gale of wind and the Princess Gael as committee boat. The early 90s saw me as assistant to PRO Peter Craig for the Lough regattas. Then in 1994, before I could think of any excuse, the club asked me to take over officially. Despite no further pregnancies, this arrangement continued until 2015, when Anno Domini and the ISA decreed my retirement. Over to you, David.
Meanwhile, I suppose my experience started for me much earlier in my life with the likes of assisting Donald Gleeson out in a small little boat at Wolf Regatta at possibly about the age of 7. And then basically I continued doing that until he produced his own little helpers. I swiftly moved on to the likes of the main committee boat in Dublin Bay in approximately 1985, 1986, with the large regattas with the likes of the Half-Ton Cup, assisting with flags. My main job was to assist Bill Piggott, which many of you may remember, possibly to make sure that he behaved himself, while learning all sorts on the committee boat, starting up to 15 fleets at a start. If anyone remembers flags being raised with a bent matchstick in the knot, you'll know what I mean. Finish lines often included the use of visiting naval vessels into Dublin, possibly leaving me with an enthusiasm for starting guns. Time spent doing rescue, course laying, etc., throughout all regattas on the SOD schedule led me onto the committee boat, assisting the likes of Jeff O'Donoghue, Liam Maloney, and of course Dad, before starting Mount Shannon on my own in 2003. Over to you.
We're now going to roughly go through outline procedures of setting up and running a race. This is not going to be a textbook of how to do it, but rather a thought process interspersed with some unusual incidents on the water shared between David and myself. Regatta preparations always begin months in advance with the following considerations. The most important being picking an onboard team. That is important to get people who know each other and work together and have a sense of humor. Rescue and course laying personnel, arranging equipment, marks and rescue boats, no longer, as my son points out to me, referred to as crash boats, are also take up your time. A visit to Lough was a helpful way of getting one's mind focused on the week ahead, making sure that you had all the necessary equipment, bits and pieces, and personnel. About 1985, we started the tradition of warming up the guns as we left Lough on our trip back to Lough Derg, ably assisted by the likes of Tony Dean, John Marriage, George Henry, and let off multiple broadsides to the event. Regatta Monday begins with a briefing, hour gun, and finally on the water. I can't stress the importance of getting out there an hour before, at least, before the start, to identify the race area, and of course monitor the wind, accompanied by the course layers. Rescue boats filter out with the fleet. Then inevitably we find an anchorage in the deepest part of the lake, much to the joy of the man or woman who's going to have to drag the anchor up again. Radio chatter commences. We use marine VHFs now, but for a time we used PMRs, used by other concerns. One day, waiting for the start at anchor, I heard this voice coming over the PMR. "Hey Bert, where art thou?" And I sort of brought me up all standing, and the reply came from, "I'm up on top of number 2. So I was wondering what the hell was going on. Perhaps it was an inversion, and the voices were coming from the northern UK. So I waited for a minute and then cut in and said, "Would the station broadcasting please identify yourself?" So very soon afterwards, there was a tentative "hello," and I said, "Where are you speaking from?" And he said, "I'm on top of Mungret chimney in the cement factory." So he was down in Limerick, and his height carried the signal. So we decided that perhaps we'd better switch channels, because I had visions of my saying 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, up, and the chimney falling down with the man still on top. Anyway, we got over that. The duties on board have to be divided. Before the 5-minute gun, the PRO is concentrating on the windward mark and the start line. Laying a start line from the Phoenix is relatively easy, because there's a line across the deck just beside the mast, and you can sight the pin end very easily. But I always used to wonder how David Coote not only got the line square, but always the right length, until I found he had a bit of stick pre-made, which he held at arm's length and sighted the Phoenix, and it had little notches in it for various lengths of line. Very good, very good. Bias on the line, I always tried to keep absolutely straight, but if it wasn't kept straight and went veered off to one way or the other, I would try and vary it for the next race to keep competitors on their toes. I always thought it was a bad idea to have a permanent port bias. Anyway, back to David.
Very simply, my job at that stage, once we're anchored and I'm happy that we're not moving anywhere, is to leave the race officer to setting up his windward mark and his start line. And I start to deal with the likes of timekeeping, looking at counting the rescue, making sure we have a right ratio out there. Quite often I would also get the next set of marks, so your jibe and your leeward, in approximate areas, and tell the course layers to sit. They would sit there and basically hover until further notice. I would often also be in contact with the shore, making sure that the last boats have left, everyone's on their way, and approximately how many competitors we have that day. Just tapping Dad on the shoulder every couple of minutes with an update on time, and finally bringing him in with about 5 minutes before the 5 minute to go through a final checklist and see whether there any reason that we both didn't agree that the race sequence could start. Once we were both happy that the course was on all right, we had enough rescue and everyone else was happy, the first gun happened. Over to you.
It's the PRO's final chance to adjust the start line. You have just that 1 minute to do that, while the number 2 superintends the flags, guns, and the countdown. 4 minute gun, we're now committed. We have 2.5 minutes to watch the jostling and for places on the line. You can always see the top 10 keeping out of trouble as their main, whatchamacallit. It's a wonder to watch it. Whereas the amateurs will barge in and barge around the place, get themselves into trouble, get themselves into bad wind, etc., etc. Just before the start, of course, you have the odd, incident, one of which was a laser removed the port shroud of the main mast of the Phoenix, and that came crashing down. We had to throw up a postponement. That won't happen again. There is 6mm stainless steel wire holding it up now. David.
Other things that I suppose have happened during that kind of 2.5 minutes, people are always very keen, particularly the younger generation, to get themselves jostled in for the best position, intent on getting that perfect start. Moving up from behind the Phoenix at full speed, intent on shaving the counterstern. This particular boat shaved it so closely, he removed our 6-foot ensign mast off the end of the boat with the ensign. Fortunately, both were recovered, but a very awkward apology ensued that evening from him, accompanied by his father, who had frog marched him up the jetty. Another thing that had happened, I really remember very well, was one of our crew, Peter Dennis Nedson, who some of you may remember. He often enjoyed coming and visiting on board for the week of the regatta as a rest from his usual work, which involved travel quite often to the likes of Japan and back again. He came on board that morning explaining that it was quite likely he was going to have to take a very important phone call. And were it to happen, whatever was going on, he was just going to have to take the call. Sure as hell, within that 2.5 minutes that day, his phone rang. He had to drop the flag, run for his phone, and of course started his conversation about whatever was going on in work that day. With that, I shot the cannon for the 1 minute. He stopped for a second. The other end asked, "What on earth is going on?" Peter froze for a second, thought, considered replying, incoming, paused again, and explained that he was on a committee boat helping to start a race. 1 minute to go, obviously, other things have happened, and quite often with the advent of the new sailing watches, which a lot of us use, there's a lovely large start and stop button on the front of it. It's only at this stage that I've realized a couple of times that I've actually banged my watch off the mast or something else and stopped the countdown. Many of you will now understand why we now use real time for the purposes of starting on board, so nothing could stop the watch. My other duties at that stage are to make sure that the pin end and the spotter is in place. Radio silence is everywhere else. Nobody else is to talk. Only the race officer, the number 2, and the guy at the end, the pin end, are on the radio. The 3 guns are loaded, and the other classes have been told to get out of the way. Over to you.
I've got into the habit, I think, effectively of using a loud hailer to clear the line. Fair warning without mentioning numbers. I suspected it works, well, I know it works very well. I can see people coming back from the line who were coming up too close or even over it and going back again. Continuous time check going on and countdown to the start. We wait for the pin end opinion and give the PRO's judgment. Fair start? Yes, even though if the whole fleet are over the line, you can still have a fair start. All clear? Fine. Individual or general, pick them out. Guy Atkinson can either go back and collect those who are premature starters and bring them back, which used to be the norm, isn't quite the norm now. You normally let the fleet go now. Guy Atkinson also can wash boats back over the starting line, as he did many times with optimists in the Optimist Nationals. I sent him down the line 10, 15 seconds before the start to wash people back over the line. Fleet have left now. We've recorded the start time. The crew to coffee duties, always a dry boat on the Phoenix, probably apocryphal stories of competitors knocking on reveling committee boats, flagships, asking to be finished. The PRO and his number 2 observe the beat and finalize jibe and leeward positions. Some course layers are released to rescue as needed. Onboard recorders checking rounding positions in case of having to shorten the race. Other things happen as well. One afternoon evening race in Lough, I sent the fleet off from inside the Corriqueens to a beat outside the Corriqueens, and the rain and mist came down. The fleet disappeared from my sight, and I was obviously inside the Corriqueens. And Sparky Hannah and Donald Gleeson were outside the Corriqueens at Windward and Leeward Mark, respectively. I hoped. I couldn't see them. I had no idea whether they were there. And I called them on radio and called, and finally I got Donald, and he said, it was very, very, very misty out there. And I said, can you see Sparky? And he says, well, me binoculars are so misted up, I may as well be looking out of me arse. So that was the however, the race did proceed and went fine. Another time I was running a morning race, an important race, and I decided to do a funny course with a very, very long beat with a leeward mark halfway up it. And you had to leave the mark halfway up the beat on your port side. And as the boats went up along the beat, the wind went round and round and round and finally went south. And the weather mark, the ultimate weather mark, ended up outside Gary Kennedy. That was fine until I was looking for the weather mark layer. Again, Donal, no sign of Donal. And I suddenly realized after about 3 minutes, he appeared out of the pub, down onto the boat and back into the fleet again. Poor old Donal. Yes, David.
I suppose some of the championship courses took the shape of other than a triangle, and sometimes we introduced the likes of the parallelogram, which added to the complexity of instructing the course to be set. To make sure the dimensions would work, I would sometimes sit down and work out all the angles, the bearings, and the reciprocal bearings so that we had a perfectly square course. You would often call the course layers and make sure that from their point of view, where they were looking to the next marker, could they give the bearing, could they get the reciprocal, and obviously the wind direction. One of our professors was asked for a bearing to and from her leeward, to the leeward and from the wind, and finally came back with the reading of 390 degrees. Silence on board. Silence on the radio. Can you confirm that reading again, please? 390 degrees, followed by a realization and, oh my God, I know what I've just done. At which point everyone on the radio started laughing. Occasionally you get other people who come in to help you for a day. Somebody's had to drop out for a day, and you get somebody else who comes in, and you expect that they are, of course, tuned in the way that you are and everyone else has been for the rest of the week. And occasionally you call them up and said, can you advise on the wind, please? At which point, one time, the response was, it's going round. Silence on the radio. Looked at each other. Can you please confirm what the wind is doing? It's going round. End of conversation. On to the next person. After coffee, obviously, we onwards to keeping a rejig of the course if necessary, getting a rounding and keeping an update of rescue, anything that may have happened, and hoping that the back of the fleet are on the same leg before, if we're trying to change the course. Often we couldn't change the course because the back enders prevented that. Anyway, all things are going well. It's time to raise the anchor and head to the finishing area if you can. One evening race, we had started the race, or we got the race off, and the call came out to get the anchor up. Come on, we'll go and follow the race for a little bit, and then we can go in behind Goose and finish the race. Great, up with the anchor. I started grinding away as usual, knowing that we were only in about 15 foot of water and that the bottom was very sandy. No problem, hopefully. However, the winch started getting harder and harder to grind in, and himself was giving out hell to me from the steering position, giving out hell that I should give up my cigarettes and winch that bloody anchor in. Come on, hurry up, we've things to be doing. I finally went into low gear on the winch and kept grinding. It was only then that I noticed that the waterline on the Phoenix was now below water. I was actually pulling the bow of the Phoenix down. Coot came over in the dory to see what the hell was going on. And just as the anchor came too close to water level, we realized that we had about 60 mil link chain fouled over the flukes of the anchor. Coot and we looked at each other and eventually got a line and a fender tied to the chain, unfluked it, and we rushed in to finish off the race. About 2 days later, we rallied a team of young fit lads, and we all went out to retrieve what ended up being a mooring for obviously a boat of the earlier century just outside St. David's. We came home at the end of that week with 3 lengths of long chain, 3 shackles, and 2 mooring anchors. The anchors were approximately 4 and 5 foot long each. So, as I said, having got those on, let's make sure we get those in. Heavy winds also sometimes gave us a bit of a race with the fleet, getting the Phoenix back in and quite literally putting the foot to the floor to get in, jump ashore with the lines and fire the first gun. Over to you.
Home finishes had one advantage, one less anchoring. However, it also presented other issues. Spectators who would be cheering for little Jonny only to find that he was over the line at the start anyway. Being asked were we selling barbecue tickets for Wednesday night. Could we move so that they could take a photograph? Anyway, having got over those things, the finish you have in total silence. 2 sets of results recorded, one forward at the main mast and one aft, totally separate. The PRO calling results, a recorder with paper and pencil, could take 30 minutes and interfere with our tea or lunchtime. Number 2 signals and organizers wind down a rescue and ensures all boats are home and identified. David.
Often in mornings, it all seemed, in championships, we had to wait around quite a bit for the wind to fill in. And one year, if you remember, we had difficulty getting ammunition for the cannons, and we resorted to using shotguns. One morning while we were waiting out for the wind, Guy Atkinson, unknown to me, had found a dead bird in the bottom of his rib. And as we finally made the decision that we weren't going to race that morning, and I pulled out the shotgun, loaded it up, and aimed for the sky, he threw the bird up into the air as I pulled the trigger, at which point the dead bird landed beside my foot on the deck. Its burial ensued afterwards.
Yeah.
To you?
We often sat there in flat calm and on waiting for the wind to come in. I always reckoned that if I could read the Irish Times on deck, there was not enough wind for racing. That was my criterion. On the other hand, Coote used to sit alongside demanding organ music. Why he had a predilection for organ music, I don't know. But I nearly burnt the radio out, or at least the tape recorder out, with the volume required to keep him happy. Yes, David.
One of the mornings, it was a Thursday morning also, again waiting for the wind to fill in a bit. My darling wife had the lie-in in the morning, having been the chef for the barbecue the night before. So she was quite happily down in the aft cabin and Ruth Delany had been on board and decided she'd rather like to sit down on the aft cabin covering. So studiously did up the zips again of the aft cabin. About 20 minutes later, Grace wanted to get out of the aft cabin. And at this point, there were many boats either tied up to the aft of the Phoenix or very close, at which point they saw a little hand coming out underneath the cover, trying to get up at the zips. Let me out, let me out. Much hilarity to that one.
Back to more serious things. We used regularly upwind pilots for live updates. Bert Corbett for many years and Peter Delany later, to give us some idea of what weather was coming down from the west. In the old days, we used to ring Shannon Airport, used to go across with the 5 pence in our pockets and go to the telephone box in Drummondere and ring our contact in Shannon Airport in the meteorological air meteorological service. who would feed us the day's forecast, which was extremally accurate, I may add. But nowadays, of course, you get it online and taken all the whatchamacallit out of it. David.
There are obvious challenges that happen at the start and the end of the season that people don't often consider about. They don't particularly happen during the main regattas, but we often deal with a lot denser air, certainly at Mount Shannon Regatta and quite often at Wolf Regatta, which has its results. The first one that really happened to me in Mount Shannon was the first day of the regatta. We knew the wind was going to increase as the weekend went on. So it was agreed by mutual consent of the entire fleet and myself, open brackets, back to Jock Smith and being open with your competitors, that we would put in a couple of reefs and get out in Mount Shannon as quickly as we could and see what happened. Laid the course, got the race going, and the fleet proceeded to the windward mark. The first 4 boats nearly that went around the windward mark snapped their masts. What I really didn't realize at the time was that we had a visitor to the regatta that day, Harman from the ISA. Quickly, we abandoned the race and got ashore, went and had a quick chat with him. He said this was a fantastic race, great conditions, shame about the masts. The other example of the denser air, again, was at Mount Shannon, where, again, having spoken to the competitors, we said, yes, we'd go out with a couple of reefs in. Again, we knew the wind was going to build. We had quite a beautiful force 3 at the start of the race. And again, by the time the fleet had got to the windward mark, we had a force 7, at which point John and Stephen O'Driscoll, accompanied by Rob O'Donoghue, planed from the windward mark through the jibe and to the leeward. If you don't believe me, go onto YouTube. The video's there from about 10 years ago. It was quite sensational seeing a full plane the whole way in very protected waters, but an awful lot of wind. Grace's introduction to the regatta scene dated back to 2003. And again, it was a glorious day during the main regatta. She'd never seen all of this sailing business before, but was quickly reassured that it was all right at the end of the first race, when David Coote went ashore in hunky-dory and returned to the Phoenix with a full tray of pints, holding them like a waiter, and delivered them on the deck of the Phoenix. She thought this was quite good. The only other danger we really had on board was occasionally Ruth would appear with her video camera. We were conscious that the camera appeared every now and then and had been told to behave and mind our words. However, it was always reported back to us by the end of the year that she spent the entire winter editing out what we had said. Over to you.
All too quickly comes the end of the regatta. We always had a debriefing on board, sandwiches and drink available. My lips are sealed about the carry-on. One Commodore's requests to attend prize giving had to be repeated 2 or 3 times before the crew finally tacked their way up to the club. Before I finish, I just want to give my heartfelt thanks to my wife, sons, and long-suffering daughter-in-law, and to all those people throughout the years who formed part of my team on board committee boats, especially on the Phoenix, but also on duties in the West Coast with Waiora and other dinghy events. Apart from family, the regulars included Ruth Delany, John Marriage, Tony Dean, Peter Dennison Edson, Angus O'Brolacon, Mark Hanna, George Tottenham, John Lewis, Natalie Guy, and many others, all of whom contributed so much towards Jock Smith's philosophy of running a happy and efficient outfit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John and Dave. Does anybody have any questions or any comments? If so, please unmute yourself.
Hi.
Oh, Peter.
Oh, hi. And do you ever think of doing these sort of, what do they do now? Windward leeward without straight down, windward leeward without a jibe mark courses, or is that, or is the jibe the most fun part of the whole thing?
I think you've answered your own question, Peter.
Yes.
I personally think windward, I'm out of it now, so to speak, for 4 or 5 years, but I think the windward lewards do have something to commend them, with a slight offset at the weather mark, so you don't get tied up, etc. But generally, I think generally Shannons would prefer a triangular course. We tried the rectangular trapezoids for a bit, but they didn't work particularly well and weren't that popular.
Yeah, yes, I must say the problem. The problem with the windward leeward directing of Shannon is that it doesn't half make for some exciting rolling if there's lots of wind. Could get a few good capsizes.
Peter, we had windward lewards about 5, 6 years ago at Lough for one regatta.
Yeah.
And the general consensus was, apart from the fun of falling in, there wasn't very much for the crew to do on a straight run. And for that, we sort of abandoned it because the crew seemed to get far more pleasure doing reaches rather than a straight run. John, I'd just like to ask you, how do you set the length of the line? Hardly with a bit of wood.
You get used to it, Philip, but it is generally, you know, the international thought is 1.5 boat lengths.
Yeah, and a lot of the rescue boats now would have GPS. So if you've actually given them the length that you want, they literally come alongside you, hit a waypoint, and go away for that desired distance.
I gather some of the PROs who play golf have one of these things that they use for measuring distances on a golf course.
Yeah, they do, yes. But Mr. David Coote's bit of stick with a couple of notches in it was as accurate as any.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Can I have a quick question? Can anyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. I feel a little bit of an imposter because I've never started under the Phoenix in a sod, which is kind of surprising. I started under the Phoenix in an Optimist in 1997 at the Munsters, and I've started under the Phoenix in a J24, but never actually in a sod. And my question to the OD, or PRO, whatever you'd like, is committee boat or pin end? What's your favorite?
For spectacle, definitely committee boat. I always leave.
Yes.
I always leave a fishing boat astern to get people well away from the boat. There was only one incident that David recalled that our ensign staff was taken off by a certain gentleman. But apart from that, people kept reasonably well away. The only problem with the Phoenix is she swings to the wind a bit. And in lasers especially, who pull alongside at the extremely close to the committee boat, might find 30 tons of committee boats sliding sideways towards them. And they've no way of getting out of the way. And the 1 minute rule being in place, you lean over the side and say, round the ends, after a tiny little tap, which is very embarrassing for them.
If you'd like to try it, you can always come to Mount Shannon next year anyway, where you'll find the Phoenix, and you can bring your sod there and try it.
Well, I went downtown, or downriver as they say, or downtown is probably the wrong way to say it, last year, and it was fantastic. I would have gone downtown this year, but the COVID. But I'd love to have a run at the Phoenix and a sod now. You know, I can't wait now. So bring it back. You know, I feel I'm missing something in the fleet. I need a sod start with the Phoenix.
Well,
see you next Easter.
It was great fun in a couple of regattas. We had over 65 entries in Derg of sods, and you had about 55, 57 boats on the line. And I'm sorry I don't have many photographs of that. We were too busy on the committee boat, but we nearly put in an intermediate committee boat, Mark, what would you, on the line to try and keep them back and get some order on the line.
I loved, I'll go off the line now, but I love to talk about sending a crash boat down the line to push the oppies back so they weren't over. I was definitely one of those oppies back in the 1990s, which I particularly like, you know. Thanks very much, John and David. Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Right here. First of all, thank you very much, John and David, for a lovely talk, and thank you for allowing me to serve with you over many, many years. And I've shared a photo in chat of it was a photo of you standing at the mast, which is the last year at Lough Derg. But just going back to that Optimus story, once we had Guy Atkinson going up and down the line, keeping them back from, trying to get them back to the line. The other major problem we had at that event was parents in ribs coming near the course and coming inside the exclusion zone. And the best cause for that was not a rib. It was an old, one of the very old fishing boats of the club with a 4-horsepower engine with Donald Gleeson at the helm. And he would just go along, slow as anything, going, if you just don't fucking get back, I'll disqualify your child. And that was it. These people had never been spoken to in that way before in their lives, but very effective.
One gentleman was really acting the maggot and gesticulating to his child or children on the course. And I called him over to the Phoenix, and I picked up a 56-pound weight that was sitting on the bow and hung it over the side. And I said, if you don't stop that, I will drop this blank weight through your bottom of your bloody boat. So that solved that.
Hello, John and David. Thank you. It was a great, lovely talk. Can you? I've a vague memory though of an incident of the Corriqueens, or no, off the Mountaineer, where a boat was sailing along and a beautiful 4 or 5 pound trout jumped out of the water into the boat. I think it was Frank Brown and Natalie's boat. I can't remember though.
Frank Guy.
Oh, Frank Guy. Yeah. Thanks.
You're absolutely correct, Alan. And I'm not sure which year it was. I think it was either 87 or 88, and we were racing the 108. But I'm delighted you've exaggerated the size of the fish suitably.
Well, you know, Carden, it just jumped.
It was significantly smaller. It was about 1.25 pounds. But the sad bit was we had a great plan for that trout, and our plan was to make a trophy of it for husband and wife teams.
Good, yeah.
And because we were in a tent or something like that at the time, we entrusted the trout to our third hand, who I won't name this time, and he took it away and put it in a freezer. And when we went to collect it, we were advised that it had been eaten.
Oh,
very tasty, apparently.
It's got a happy ending. Well, that was lovely, John. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Right, any final questions or any final comments before we wrap up?
I just, John, David, thank you.
Frozen.
Very much. Once most people are gone, could we name and shame a few of the sinners that you? I mean, we haven't even stirred up anything here. Surely there's some name and shame opportunities, and I'm up for one of them anyway. So
I'll stop the record shortly.
I'd just like to say to Dave.
Oh, keep the record going.
I'd like to say to Dave and John and Sandra and to Grace, thank you very much for allowing me to be the coffee wench. And I didn't poison any of you over the years. And I gave John a very few chocolate biscuits because I was under strict instructions. And I think, according to Sandra, I raised the flags up and down
Indeed. Indeed.
I got the biscuits, Natalie. Thank you very much.
All over Zoom now.
Oh.
Okay. Do you want to say something?
John, I'm just remembering the that famous Oppie Nationals, and a few people are referencing sinners. Probably the cleverest thing I've ever seen a race committee led by you do was record your how do I say it, recollections of who was over the line, and then play that at the prize giving. And I always remember a parent of a good friend of mine who didn't really understand the whole racing scene, just hearing his child's sale number called out at the prize giving for being over the line and thinking, this is fantastic. This is the proudest moment of my life.
I could write a book on that championship
event.
Anyway,
great. Thank you very much, everybody. We have Vincent Delany next week, and then we will have one final speaker after that before we call it a day on the Zoom series for now and wrap it up. So I'll be emailing everyone that speaker in the next few days.
Right. I just say thank you very much to everybody. I really enjoyed this afternoon. It's a great COVID break. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks for organising it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
John. Dave.
Thank you, Dave.
Good.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you.